Family Feud is a game show. It is supposed to be fun. Families come on, they answer survey questions, they laugh, they win money or they don't, and they go home with a story to tell at Thanksgiving. That is how it is supposed to work. But on a Tuesday afternoon in June 2025, something happened on the Family Feud stage that was not fun. It was not entertainment. It was real life unfolding in front of 200 people and a bank of cameras that captured every second of it. A marriage that had been cracking in private for years finally shattered in public, one answer at a time, until the damage was visible to everyone in the room. The husband and wife were not yelling. They were not fighting. It was worse than that. They were being honest. And the honesty delivered through the innocent framework of a survey game exposed a fracture so deep that Steve Harvey did something he had never done before. He stopped the game, not during a commercial, not between rounds. He stopped the game in the middle of a round, walked to the center of the stage, and told both families and the entire audience that what was happening on this stage was more important than any game, and that he was not going to let it continue without addressing it. What he said next would be replayed over 100 million times around the world. If you believe that some things matter more than winning, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Because what happened when Steve Harvey stopped that game is one of the most honest moments ever captured on television. The Benson family from Richmond, Virginia, arrived at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta looking, by every visible measure, like a family that had it all figured out. There were 5 of them. Keith Benson, 50, a civil engineer who designed municipal water systems for a firm in Henrico County. His wife, Nadine, 47, a family therapist with a private practice in the Fan District of Richmond. Their daughter, Simone, 23, a second-year medical student at Virginia Commonwealth University. Their son, Julian, 19, a freshman at Howard University studying journalism. And Nadine's mother, Miss Alma, 72, a retired church administrator who had spent 41 years running the day-to-day operations of Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church and who had agreed to appear on the show because, as she told her daughter, "I want to see Steve Harvey in person before the Lord calls me home, and this is the most efficient way to do it." They wore matching cream-colored polo shirts. They had professional headshots taken backstage. In the pre-show warm-up, they laughed and joked with the other family and the production assistants. They looked like they belonged on a brochure for something aspirational. But families, like buildings Keith designed, can look structurally sound from the outside, while the foundation underneath is shifting in ways that only the people standing inside can feel. Nadine Benson spent her professional life listening to marriages fall apart. She was a licensed marriage and family therapist with 16 years of experience, and she was very good at her job. Her clients trusted her. Her colleagues respected her. She had published articles in professional journals about communication patterns in long-term marriages and had been a guest speaker at conferences where she talked about the signs of emotional disconnection and the steps couples could take to rebuild intimacy before it was too late. She knew the vocabulary. She understood the patterns. She could identify the warning signs from across a room. What she could not do, what she had never been able to do, was apply any of that knowledge to her own marriage. The irony was not lost on her. She had clients who came to her because their husbands had stopped talking to them, and she would sit in her leather chair and guide them through exercises designed to reopen channels of communication. And then she would drive home to a house where her own husband had not asked her a meaningful question in 3 years. She had clients who told her they felt invisible in their own homes, and she would validate their feelings with clinical precision and genuine empathy, and then she would walk through her own front door and feel the same invisibility settle over her like dust. Nadine Benson was the therapist who could heal everyone's marriage except the one she went home to every night. She had written about this phenomenon in one of her published papers. She called it the practitioner's blind spot. She just never imagined she would become its most vivid case study. Nadine had grown up in Petersburg, Virginia, the only child of Alma and the late Reverend Charles Whitmore. Her father had been the pastor of Greater Mount Zion for 38 years before he passed away from a stroke when Nadine was 30. He was a man of enormous warmth and enormous expectations. He expected his daughter to be excellent at everything she did, and she had delivered on that expectation with a consistency that would have been impressive if it had not also been exhausting. Straight as through school, full scholarship to William and Mary, master's degree in clinical psychology from George Washington University, licensed therapist by 28, private practice by 31. Her father had lived long enough to see her open the practice, but not long enough to see what it cost her to maintain it. The cost was this: Nadine had spent so much of her life being excellent for other people that she had never learned how to ask for anything for herself. She gave advice. She did not take it. She solved problems. She did not admit to having them. She held space for other people's pain. She did not hold space for her own. Keith Benson was, by every external metric, a good man. He did not drink excessively. He did not gamble. He was not unfaithful. He paid the bills, attended the children's events, and maintained the house with the quiet diligence of an engineer who understood that systems required upkeep. What Keith did not understand, or did not know how to understand, was that his marriage was also a system, and he had stopped maintaining it, not suddenly, not dramatically. The way a pipe corrodes, invisibly, incrementally, until one day the pressure finds the weak point and everything floods. Keith's withdrawal had begun around the time he turned 45. A major project at his firm had collapsed due to a contractor's negligence, and Keith had been blamed despite having flagged the problem months earlier. He was not fired, but he was passed over for a promotion that everyone in the office knew he deserved. The injustice burrowed into him. He became quieter. More internal. He replaced conversation with routine. He came home, ate dinner, reviewed blueprints in his home office, and went to bed. If Nadine asked him how he was, he said fine. If she asked him to talk, he said there was nothing to talk about. He was, in his own mind, handling it. What he was actually doing was building a wall, one brick at a time, between himself and the woman who had spent her career teaching people how to tear walls down. Simone, the older child, understood the situation with a clinical clarity that came from growing up in a therapist's household. She had watched her parents drift apart with the analytical detachment of a pre-med student observing a case study, and the emotional devastation of a daughter watching her family dissolve in slow motion. She managed it by pouring herself into medical school, studying 16 hours a day, calling her mother every evening, and calling her father once a week with conversations that lasted exactly 4 minutes because Keith did not know how to sustain them beyond that. Julian, the younger one, managed it differently. He wrote about it. Journals, essays, half-finished short stories that he kept in a folder on his laptop labeled Family. He was studying journalism because he believed that telling true stories could change things. He just did not yet know how to tell his own. Miss Alma saw everything. She had been married to Reverend Whitmore for 37 years before he died, and she understood the architecture of a long marriage better than any textbook could teach. She understood that marriages had seasons, and that some seasons were winter, and that winter did not mean death if both people were willing to endure the cold together. What worried Alma about her daughter's marriage was not the distance between Keith and Nadine. Distance could be closed. What worried her was that neither of them seemed to be walking toward the other. They were standing in their own corners, waiting for the other person to move first, and the gap was getting wider every day. Alma had tried to talk to Nadine about it. Nadine had responded with the calm, professional deflection she used on everyone. "We're working through it, Mama." Alma had looked at her daughter and said, "Baby, you counsel people for a living. Don't you dare counsel me." It was the kind of thing only a mother could say, and it had landed hard enough that Nadine had excused herself from the room. The morning of the taping, Nadine dressed carefully. She wore a soft gold blouse and understated earrings. She did her own makeup with the practiced hand of a woman who spent every workday looking composed for clients, and had perfected the art of assembling a face that revealed nothing. Keith wore the matching polo and drove to the studio in near total silence. Julian sat in the back seat with his earbuds in, writing something on his phone. Simone sat beside him, texting her mother encouraging messages from 3 feet away because it felt safer than saying them out loud. Miss Alma rode in the front passenger seat and said nothing for the entire 40-minute drive. She did not need to. Her silence was its own commentary, the silence of a woman who knew that what was about to happen on that stage was going to be more than a game show, whether anyone else was ready for it or not. The Benson family was matched against the Cruz family from Orlando, Florida. Steve Harvey opened the show with his usual blend of warmth and comedy, and the audience settled into the comfortable rhythm of a Family Feud taping. During introductions, Steve reached Nadine and asked what she did for a living. "I'm a marriage and family therapist," Nadine said with a polished smile. Steve grinned. "So you fix marriages for a living?" Nadine laughed lightly. "I try." Steve turned to Keith. "And how do you feel about being married to someone who fixes marriages?" Keith paused for a beat too long before answering. "I think she's very good at her job." It was a technically correct answer. It was also the most revealing non-answer anyone could have given. Steve's smile remained, but his eyes registered the gap between what Keith said and what Keith meant. The audience felt it too, the subtle vibration of something unspoken. Steve moved on. The first round went to the Bensons. The family performed well as a unit, picking up points efficiently. Keith gave a solid answer. Nadine gave 2. The children contributed. Miss Alma gave an answer that made the entire studio laugh, a deadpan response delivered with the timing of a woman who had spent 4 decades managing church committees and knew exactly how to command a room. Everything appeared normal. But people who had been watching closely, Steve Harvey among them, noticed that Keith and Nadine never looked at each other. Not once. They stood at the same podium, inches apart, facing the same direction, and their eyes never met. It was the kind of detail that most people would miss. Steve Harvey did not miss it. The second round brought the first visible crack. The question was, name something couples stopped doing after being married for a long time. It was the face-off, and Keith was at the podium against the crew's family representative. Keith thought for a moment and said, talking. It was said flatly, without humor, without irony. Just a single word dropped onto the stage like a stone. The board revealed it as the number 2 answer, 35 points. The audience clapped, but the clapping was muted. Something in the way Keith said it had drained the fun from the room. The Bensons played the round. Answers came. Going on dates. Saying I love you. Listening. Each one a small confession disguised as a survey response. Then it was Nadine's turn. She stepped to the podium and said, asking each other how they really feel. It was the number 1 answer, 41 points. The audience applauded warmly. But there was an undertone now, a collective awareness that these were not just answers. These were dispatches from a marriage that was speaking through the framework of a game show because it could not speak any other way. Keith stood at the family podium. He had heard his wife's answer. His face did not change, but his posture shifted. His shoulders dropped by a fraction of an inch. It was the posture of a man absorbing a blow he had been expecting but had hoped would not come. Nadine returned to the podium and stood beside him. The gap between them, the physical inches, seemed to widen even though neither of them moved. The third round was the one that broke the surface. The question landed in the studio like a match on gasoline. Name something one spouse is afraid to tell the other. The crew's family had control of the board, but they struck out and the Bensons had a chance to steal. Steve turned to the Benson family. You need one answer to steal the round. Talk it over. The family huddled. Simone suggested that they're unhappy. Julian suggested that they want to leave. Keith said nothing. Nadine said nothing. They stood in the huddle, surrounded by their children and Alma, and they were the 2 quietest people in the group. Finally, Steve said, I need an answer. Nadine stepped forward. She walked to the podium and placed her hands on the surface. She looked at Steve, she looked at the board, and then she turned and looked at Keith. It was the first time they had made direct eye contact during the entire taping. The studio seemed to hold its breath. 200 people understood instinctively that whatever Nadine was about to say was not just an answer to a survey question. That it might be too late, Nadine said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dry, but the words carried a weight that pressed down on every person in that room. This was not a woman guessing at what a survey might say. This was a woman speaking a truth she had been carrying for years, the truth that she, the therapist who helped other people save their marriages, was terrified that her own marriage had passed the point of saving. And she had said it on national television, looking directly at her husband because she had run out of private places to say it. The board revealed the answer. Number 1, 38 points. The steal was successful, but nobody celebrated. The audience sat in stunned quiet. Simone had pressed her hand to her mouth. Julian was staring at the floor. Miss Alma closed her eyes and bowed her head, not in prayer exactly, but in the posture of a woman accepting that the thing she had feared was now real and visible and could no longer be managed in private. Keith stood at the podium. He was looking at Nadine. His face had changed. The controlled, neutral expression he had worn all day was gone. In its place was something raw, something exposed. He looked like a man standing in a house that had just lost its roof, suddenly aware of how much he had been hiding behind the structure without realizing the structure was all that was holding him together. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again, and then in a voice that cracked on the second word, he said, "Is it?" 2 words, directed at Nadine, asked in front of 200 people, and however many millions would eventually see the clip. Is it? Is it too late? The question he had never asked in private, delivered on a game show stage because the game show had accidentally become the most honest room in their marriage. Nadine looked at him. The professional composure she had worn like armor for 16 years flickered. Her chin trembled. Her eyes filled. She did not answer immediately. The silence between them expanded until it filled the entire studio, and in that silence, every person in the audience could feel the weight of a marriage suspended between a question and an answer that had not yet been given. And then Steve Harvey stopped the game. Steve set his cue cards on the podium. He did not signal to the production team. He did not look at the cameras. He walked to the center of the stage, positioning himself between the Benson family podium and the board, and he raised both hands slightly, palms out, the universal gesture for stop. "Hold on," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The studio was already silent. "We're going to stop for a minute." The production team exchanged glances. The stage manager put her hand on her headset. The director, watching from the control room, made the decision to keep every camera rolling. Steve looked at Keith, then at Nadine, then at the space between them, and he spoke. "I'm going to say something right now that I probably shouldn't say on a game show, but I've been doing this long enough to know when a game is a game and when it's something else, and what's happening on this stage right now is something else." He paused. The audience was completely still. This man just asked his wife if it's too late. And this woman, who tells other families how to save their marriages for a living, just told a room full of strangers that she's afraid it might be. And I am not going to stand here and call the next question while two people are standing 5 feet apart deciding the future of their family. The audience began to respond, murmurs of agreement, soft applause, but Steve continued and the room settled back. "I'm not a therapist," Steve said. "I'm a TV host. I've been married 3 times. I've failed at this more than I've succeeded, so I am the last person who should be giving marriage advice." He looked at Keith. "But I'm going to tell you something, man, that I wish somebody had told me when I was standing where you're standing. That woman right there did not say it's too late. She said she's afraid it might be. Those are 2 different things. Afraid means she's still in it. Afraid means she still cares. If she didn't care, she wouldn't be afraid. She'd be gone." Keith's face crumbled. Not fully. But the controlled surface fractured, and beneath it was a grief that the audience could see plainly, the grief of a man who understood in a single moment that he had been interpreting his wife's silence as acceptance when it had actually been fear. Steve turned to Nadine. "And you? You spend every day helping other people say the hard things, and I watched you carry that truth around this stage for an hour before you finally let it out. You're a therapist. You know better than anyone that the thing you're most afraid to say is usually the thing that needs to be said the most." Nadine's tears fell. She did not wipe them. She stood at the podium and let them come, and in that moment she was not a therapist. She was not a professional. She was a woman who had spent 16 years holding space for other people's pain and had finally, unexpectedly, been given space for her own. Steve looked at both of them. "I'm going to ask you both something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not for me, not for this audience, for your kids who are standing right there watching this." He glanced at Simone and Julian, both of whom had tears on their faces. "Keith, do you still love this woman?" Keith did not hesitate. "Yes." His voice broke on the word, but it came immediately, without calculation, without the careful filtering that had defined his communication for 3 years. "Yes, I love her. I have always loved her, I just forgot how to show it." Steve nodded. "Nadine, do you still love this man?" Nadine looked at Keith. She looked at him the way she had not looked at him in years, directly, fully, without the protective distance of clinical detachment. "I love him so much that I have been terrified of saying what I said today because I was afraid the answer would be that yes, it is too late, and I didn't know if I could survive hearing that." The studio broke. The audience was on its feet, crying, applauding, making a noise that was not the sound of a game show crowd. It was the sound of 200 people witnessing something sacred and responding the only way they knew how. Miss Alma, who had been standing at the edge of the family group with her eyes closed, opened them. She walked to the center of the podium, took her daughter's hand in her left and her son-in-law's hand in her right, and she pulled them together. Not gently. With the firm, no-nonsense authority of a woman who had managed a church for 41 years and knew when people needed to stop standing apart and start standing together. Keith and Nadine's hands touched. Then their fingers intertwined. Then Keith pulled Nadine toward him, and she let him, and they stood in the middle of a game show stage, holding each other while their children surrounded them and 200 strangers wept. Steve Harvey watched. He did not interrupt. He let the moment be what it was. And when the noise finally subsided enough for him to be heard, he said quietly, "That is what this show is for. Not the points, not the money, that." He pointed at the family. "That right there, that's what family means." The ovation that followed was unlike anything the production crew had experienced. It did not build and crest and fade. It sustained. For over 2 minutes, the audience stood and clapped and cried, and the sound filled the studio like something physical, something warm, something that felt like it could hold things together. The game resumed. Steve asked both families if they wanted to continue. The Bensons said yes. The Cruz family, who had been watching the entire scene with open emotion, said yes. The final round was played with a different energy, lighter, more generous. Both families were laughing again. Keith and Nadine were standing closer to each other at the podium. Their shoulders were touching. It was a small thing, but small things are what marriages are built from and rebuilt from. The Bensons qualified for fast money. Nadine volunteered to go second. Keith went first. He walked to the podium, and for the first time all day, he looked back at Nadine before the clock started. She nodded at him. He nodded back. It was a 2-second exchange that contained more communication than the last 3 years of their marriage. Keith answered the 5 questions with a focus that had been absent from his performance all day. He scored 134 points. Then Nadine walked to the podium. The audience quieted, not because they were told to, but because they understood. Steve began. Name something that is worth fighting for. Your family, Nadine said. Name something people put off for too long. The conversation they need to have, Steve's eyebrow raised. Name something you can't do alone. Heal. Name something that starts with honesty. Everything. Name something you would tell someone you love if today were your last day. Nadine paused. She looked toward Keith, who was hidden behind the partition, but whose presence she could feel the way you feel sunlight through a window. Don't give up on us, she said. The board revealed the answers. Your family for something worth fighting for. Number 1 answer. 45 points. The audience surged. The conversation they need to have for something people put off. Number 1 answer. 33 points. Steve closed his eyes for a moment. Heal for something you can't do alone. Number 1 answer. 29 points. 3 in a row. The studio was electric. Everything for something that starts with honesty. Number 1 answer. 27 points. 4 consecutive number 1 answers. People were screaming. Steve was pacing. One more. Don't give up on us for something you'd tell someone you love on your last day. Steve turned to the board. The answer lit up. Number 1, 36 points. Perfect score. 170 points. Combined with Keith's 134, the Benson family had 304 points and the $20,000 prize, but the number on the board was irrelevant. What mattered was the number that had been building all day, the number of honest words that had been said between 2 people who had stopped talking, who had stopped asking, who had stopped reaching, and who had, on the most unlikely stage imaginable, started again. Keith came out from behind the partition. He did not pump his fist. He did not point at the scoreboard. He walked straight to Nadine, and he held her. The audience responded with an ovation that the crew later measured as the longest sustained audience response in the show's current run. Simone and Julian joined their parents. Miss Alma stood beside the group with her hands clasped and her eyes closed, and when a camera found her face, she was smiling. Not a big smile. The small, private smile of a woman who had been praying for this moment and had just watched it arrive. Backstage, Steve Harvey sat with the Benson family for nearly 45 minutes. He later called it one of the most meaningful conversations of his career. He spoke with Keith and Nadine together, telling them that what they had done on that stage, the willingness to be honest in front of millions of people, was the hardest thing a married couple could do and also the most necessary. He told Nadine something that she later shared in a professional interview. He said, "You spend your life giving other people permission to be vulnerable. Today, you gave yourself permission." And it changed everything. Nadine said she had been replaying those words in her head every day since. He also spoke with Miss Alma. Their conversation was brief but deeply personal. Steve told Alma that watching her pull Keith and Nadine's hands together on stage was the single most powerful image he had ever seen on his show. Alma looked at him and said, "Mr. Harvey, I ran a church for 41 years. I have seen marriages start. I have seen them end. And I have learned that sometimes people do not need advice. They need someone to take their hand and put it where it belongs." Steve said he wanted to write that down. Alma said, "You just did. It's on camera." The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was unlike anything in the show's history. The clip of Nadine's "That It Might Be Too Late" answer was viewed over 60 million times in the first 3 days. The clip of Keith's "Is It?" response was viewed over 50 million times. But the clip that shattered every record, the one that crossed 200 million views within its first month and became the single most watched piece of Family Feud content ever produced, was Steve Harvey stopping the game. His speech, Keith and Nadine's exchange, the moment Alma pulled their hands together, and Nadine's perfect fast money round, the entire unbroken sequence was shared as a single clip that ran just over 8 minutes. Media analysts called it the most emotionally impactful 8 minutes of television produced that decade. It was translated into 31 languages. The hashtag #NotTooLate became a global phenomenon. It trended in over 40 countries simultaneously and remained in the top 10 trending topics worldwide for 11 consecutive days. The phrase was adopted by couples in crisis as a declaration of willingness to try again. Marriage counselors reported a measurable increase in new client inquiries in the weeks following the episode, with many couples citing the Benson family specifically as the reason they had finally picked up the phone. A marriage therapist in Toronto told a reporter, "I have been doing this work for 20 years. No academic paper, no TED Talk, No public awareness campaign has ever driven as many people into therapy as that 8-minute clip. One couple on a game show did more for marriage counseling in a single afternoon than our entire profession has done in a decade of outreach. The impact on the therapeutic community was particularly significant because of Nadine's profession. Her moment on stage became the subject of intense discussion among therapists, counselors, and psychologists. Professional journals published articles about the ethical and psychological dimensions of what had happened, a practicing therapist revealing her own marital struggles on national television. Some professionals expressed concern about boundaries, but the overwhelming response was one of recognition and gratitude. A therapist in Seattle wrote an essay that was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Nadine Benson did something that most of us in this profession are terrified to do, the essay read. She admitted that she was struggling, not her clients, her. She showed the world that therapists are not immune to the problems they treat, and in doing so, she gave permission to every helper, every healer, every person who spends their life holding space for others, to finally hold space for themselves. Nadine herself addressed the professional response in a keynote speech at a state counseling association conference 4 months after the episode aired. She stood before an audience of 800 therapists and spoke with the same honesty she had shown on the Family Feud stage. "I have spent 16 years sitting across from couples and asking them to be vulnerable," she said. "I have asked them to say the thing they are most afraid to say. I have asked them to look at their partner and tell the truth. And for 16 years I went home and did not do any of those things in my own marriage. Not because I didn't know how, because I was terrified. I was terrified that if I admitted my marriage was struggling, it would mean I was a fraud, that my clients would lose faith in me, that my colleagues would lose respect for me, that my mother would be disappointed in me." She paused. "A game show question forced me to say out loud what I had been whispering to myself for 3 years, and when I said it, the world didn't end. My clients didn't leave, my colleagues didn't judge me. My mother pulled my hand toward my husband's and told us to figure it out. And Steve Harvey told me that the hardest thing to do was the most necessary thing." She looked out at the audience. "So I'm telling you what I should have told myself a long time ago. You are allowed to struggle. You are allowed to need help. You are allowed to sit in the client's chair instead of the therapist's chair. Being a healer does not mean being healed. It means being honest about the places where you are still broken and brave enough to let someone help you put them back together." The standing ovation lasted over 90 seconds. Several attendees later said it was the most important professional address they had ever heard. Within 6 months, Nadine's speech had been shared in counseling programs at over 200 universities. Keith and Nadine entered couples therapy the week after the taping. They chose a therapist outside of Nadine's professional network, someone she had no history with, because she wanted to be a client, not a colleague. The therapy was difficult. Keith had to learn how to speak again, how to move past the clipped, efficient communication patterns he had developed as armor after the professional setback that had started his withdrawal. Nadine had to learn how to receive, how to sit in a room and let someone help her instead of being the one who helped everyone else. It was slow work. Rebuilding a marriage that had been silent for 3 years was not a single breakthrough, but 1,000 small decisions to reach across the gap, instead of retreating to the familiar corners. 6 months after the taping, something small happened that Nadine later described as the moment she knew they were going to be okay. She came home from her practice after a particularly difficult day, a session with a couple who had decided to divorce, and she sat on the couch without turning on any lights. She did not call anyone, she did not process it professionally, she just sat in the dark feeling the weight of it, and then Keith came downstairs. He did not ask what was wrong, he did not try to fix it. He sat down beside her in the dark and took her hand. They sat like that for 20 minutes without speaking. When Nadine finally stood up to make dinner, Keith said, "Bad session?" Nadine nodded. Keith said, "I'm here." 2 words, the simplest possible words. But they were the 2 words he had not said in 3 years, and hearing them in the dark of their own living room was worth more than any speech on any stage. Steve Harvey invited the Benson family back for a follow-up segment 9 months after the original episode. When Keith and Nadine walked onto the stage together, holding hands, the audience's standing ovation lasted over 2 minutes. They looked different, not because of their clothes or their appearance, because of the space between them. There was none. They stood shoulder to shoulder, leaning slightly into each other, occupying shared space in a way that radiated warmth. During the segment, Keith spoke publicly about his withdrawal for the first time. He described the professional setback, the shame that followed, and the way he had closed himself off from the person who could have helped him most. "I'm an engineer," he said. "I solve problems with calculations and measurements, but you can't calculate your way out of a broken marriage." You have to talk your way out, and I forgot how to talk. He looked at Nadine. My wife asked people to be honest for a living, and I was married to her for 20 years and never gave her the honesty she deserved. That changes now. That changed on this stage. Nadine spoke next. She did not use clinical language. She spoke plainly. I was afraid that saying the truth would end my marriage. Instead, it saved it, not because the truth fixed everything, but because it gave us a place to start. We finally had something real to work with instead of silence. She paused. I tell my clients every day that vulnerability is the beginning of healing. I just never had the courage to believe it about myself until Steve Harvey stopped a game show and gave me the space to try. Steve revealed during the segment that the Benson episode had directly inspired what would become the largest single initiative in Family Feud's history. In partnership with the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, the show had launched The Honest Room, a national program providing subsidized couples therapy for families who could not afford it. The program launched with $8 million in commitments from corporate sponsors, foundations, and individual donors. In its first 6 months, it had connected over 3,000 couples with licensed therapists. Steve said Nadine Benson showed the world that even the people who help other people need help sometimes. This program exists because of her, and every couple it helps is part of her legacy. The children carried the legacy in their own lives. Simone, now in her 3rd year of medical school, added a focus on family medicine, telling her mother she wanted to treat not just patients but the families around them. Julian published an essay about the experience in a national magazine. It was titled The Question My Father Asked on Television, and it explored the moment Keith said, "Is it?" and what it meant to watch your parents choose honesty over comfort on a stage in front of strangers. The essay was read by over 5 million people and was later included in a college English anthology. Julian wrote in the final paragraph, "My father asked my mother if it was too late. She didn't answer. She didn't need to." She had been answering that question every day for 3 years by staying. The answer was always the same. Not yet. Not while I'm still here. Not while there's still something worth saving. Miss Alma's moment, pulling Keith and Nadine's hands together, became one of the most replayed images in television history. It was still framed, memed, painted, and printed. A sculptor in Brooklyn created a bronze piece depicting 2 hands being drawn together by a third, titled Alma's Bridge. The piece was exhibited at a gallery in Manhattan and was purchased by a marriage counseling center that placed it in their waiting room. When Alma was told about the sculpture, she said, "That's a lot of fuss over a woman who just grabbed 2 people's hands. I've been doing that at church for 40 years. It's called an altar call." The quote went viral. Keith and Nadine Benson are still married. They still live in the same house in Richmond. Keith still designs water systems. Nadine still sees clients. But the house is different now, not structurally, emotionally. The silences that used to fill the rooms have been replaced by something else, not constant conversation, but presence. The kind of presence where 2 people occupy the same space and each one knows that the other has chosen to be there. Keith brings Nadine coffee in the morning again. Nadine asks Keith about his projects again. They sit on the porch on Sunday evenings and talk about nothing important, which is to say they talk about everything important because the nothing is where the connection lives. On the wall of Nadine's home office, next to her degrees and her professional certifications, there is a framed screenshot from the Family Feud episode. It is not the moment she gave her answer. It is not the perfect score. It is the moment Alma pulled their hands together, captured from the wide camera angle that shows Keith and Nadine and Alma and the children and the audience all in a single frame. Beneath it, in Alma's careful handwriting, is a note that reads, "It is never too late if both hands are willing." Nadine looks at it every morning before her first client arrives. And every morning it reminds her of the most important thing she has ever learned in her career as a therapist, that the truth does not destroy. It reveals, and what it reveals, if you are brave enough to look, is always the place where the healing begins. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it is not too late, that honesty is not the end of something but the beginning, and that sometimes the bravest thing 2 people can do is stop pretending and start talking. Because the conversation you are most afraid to have might be the one that saves everything.